two girls found out that the cowboy didn't have sex, so they decided to teach him. Dawn in Phantom River Town was always painted in shades of dust and gold, but today, June 12, 1888, it seemed unusually bright, almost ominous. Doris and Mabel, two sisters long accustomed to the precarious balance of this harsh land, stood by the window of their saloon, the Golden Sapphire. Their establishment, the only one in Phantom River that could boast clean liquor and decent company, served not only as a place for rest and entertainment, but also as an unofficial hub for all town news and gossip. Doris, the elder sister, with lush auburn hair that cascaded to her waist, and as the color of liquid honey, watched the deserted street. Her figure, honed by years of hard work, was both strong and feminine, clad in a tight blue dress that accentuated her curves. Mabel, the younger, with coal-black hair braided into a tight plait, and eyes as piercing as the night, appeared more reserved. She wore a practical dark green dress that concealed, but did not diminish, her stature. Both were beautiful, but their beauty was different. Doris the embodiment of sultry passion, Mabel of mysterious coolness. The air was thick with a sense of impending change. Not a minute passed before a tall rider appeared on the scorching street, kicking up plumes of reddish dust. His silhouette seemed carved from stone against the rising sun. This was Caleb O'Connor, a cowboy whispered about throughout Texas. He was about 35, and every wrinkle around his steel-gray eyes, every crease in his tan skin, seemed like an engraved story. His wide-brimmed hat hid half his face, but even through the shadow, his unwavering resolve was palpable. A perfectly trimmed mustache accentuated his firm chin. A muscular neck, broad shoulders, a powerful chest taut beneath a leather vest, under which mighty muscles, bearing traces of scars, pulsed. Fringed jeans fit perfectly on his strong thighs, and polished boots with gleaming spurs glinted in the sun. But most striking was his complete lack of any fussiness. He moved with the grace of a predator. Every step was measured, every movement filled with hidden strength. At his side hung an old but well-kept revolver, and on his belt, directly behind the holster, were 3 arrows, sharp as razors. Rumors circulated in town that he never missed, whether it was a shot from his revolver or a thrown arrow. His reputation as a silent, invincible gunman was undeniable, but with it came another, stranger rumor of his absolute reclusiveness and, oddly enough, that he had never been with a woman. This last detail was the juiciest morsel for local gossips, but no one dared speak of it openly when Caleb was near. Caleb dismounted at the hitching post in front of the saloon. His horse, a powerful black stallion with a white blaze on its forehead, snorted, exhaling steam. The cowboy carelessly but securely tied the reins and, without a glance at any of the few figures already gathering on the street, headed for the doors of the Golden Sapphire. He had never been to this town, and his appearance here was as unexpected as spring snow in the desert. He entered the saloon, and the stark contrast between the street's heat and the coolness of the room was instantly felt on his skin. Inside, it was quiet. Only a few ranchers sat at tables, sipping whiskey and engaging in unhurried conversations. Doris and Mabel, who had been watching him until this moment, exchanged quick, understanding glances. They had long since trained themselves not to show surprise or curiosity. But Caleb O'Connor's appearance was an event that could not be ignored. Caleb, ignoring those present, headed for the bar. His eyes slowly scanned the room, noting every detail, but lingering nowhere. He wore a dark blue scarf covering the lower part of his face, and only his piercing eyes were visible. He approached the counter and leaned against it, without removing his hat. Whiskey. His voice was low and hoarse, like sand sifted by the wind through rocks. There was neither politeness nor rudeness in it, only a dry demand. Doris, who was already behind the bar, nodded. She had long learned to read people from a single glance, a single word, and this man was a mystery. She filled a glass to the brim with dark amber liquid and placed it before him. He tossed a few silver dollars onto the counter, more than was required. "Keep the change," he uttered, lifting the glass. In one gulp, he emptied it, never taking his eyes off his reflection in the darkened mirror behind the bar. Mabel, who had subtly approached Doris, gently nudged her elbow. "Did you hear that, Doris? He's special," Mabel whispered, trying to keep her voice from attracting the cowboy's attention. Doris just shook her head, brushing an invisible speck of dust from the bar counter. Suddenly, the saloon door burst open with a deafening crash, and a trio of dirty, bearded men, reeking of whiskey and gunpowder, appeared in the doorway. These were the McKinley brothers, Butch, Clay, and Jess, local scourges, petty bandits who terrorize the district, making a living by cattle rustling and robbery. Butch, the largest and fiercest, with a crimson face and greasy hair, moved forward, his eyes gleaming with ill intent. He saw Caleb at the counter, and a smirk appeared on his face. Well, look who's here. What guests have graced us? Is it indeed the legendary Caleb O'Connor himself? Or did I think you'd already run off, like the last coward? Butch roared, his voice reverberating through the saloon, making the ranchers flinch. Caleb did not stir. He stood like a rock, motionless and unperturbed. The McKinley brothers, sensing his indifference, grew even bolder. He seems to have lost his tongue, or perhaps he's scared. Clay sneered, pulling out his revolver and pointing it at the ceiling. A deafening shot rang out, echoing throughout the room. Sawdust and dust rained down. Doris and Mabel did not flinch, but their gazes met for a moment. This was exactly what they feared, the destruction of peace. Caleb slowly lowered the empty glass onto the counter. The sound was barely audible in the ensuing silence. He slowly turned. Now his face was fully exposed. It was grim, devoid of any emotion, but in his eyes, a cold, almost deadly glint flared. An old scar, crossing his cheekbone, was visible on his right cheek, and on his left three thin, barely noticeable lines, as if from the claws of a wild beast. I came here for whiskey, not for your foolish games. His voice was still low, but now there was steel in it. Butch McKinley only laughed louder. Look at him, he spoke. Come on, show us what your famed revolver can do, Cowboy. Or are you only good with your tongue? With these words, Butch made a sharp movement, trying to draw his Colt, but he was too slow. Caleb moved with incredible speed. It wasn't just fast, it was instantaneous. He didn't draw his revolver. Instead, his hand darted to his belt, where the arrows were. One of the feathered arrows flashed in the air. The next moment, it had already plunged into Butch McKinley's right palm, piercing it clean through. Butch howled in pain, his revolver falling to the floor with a dull thud. Blood gushed from the wound. His brothers stared in stunned disbelief. No one in the saloon could believe their eyes. Caleb hadn't even aimed, he had simply thrown the arrow, and it found its target with such precision, as if guided by an invisible hand. That's a warning, Caleb snarled, his eyes burning with cold fire. Next time it will be worse. Clay and Jess, recovering from the shock, backed away, their faces pale. They knew the rumors of Caleb's marksmanship were not exaggerated. Butch, writhing in pain, yanked the arrow from his pawn and threw it to the floor. He clenched his fist, trying to staunch the bleeding, his face contorted with fury and humiliation. You'll regret this, Cowboy. We won't forget it, Butch croaked, and, supporting his wounded hand, the McKinley brothers hastily left the saloon, leaving behind only the smell of fear and gunpowder. The silence that settled in the saloon was deafening. The ranchers at the tables sat frozen, their mouths agape in silent astonishment. Doris and Mabel were also stunned. They had heard stories about Caleb O'Connor, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. Doris finally came to her senses and slowly walked along the bar counter to wipe away the spilled blood. Her heart pounded like crazy, but she maintained complete composure on her face. Mabel approached her, her eyes burning with mixed feelings: fear, admiration, and something else she couldn't define. He's really that strong, Mabel whispered, looking at Caleb, who had already turned back to the counter as if nothing had happened. Doris looked at the arrow lying on the floor. Stronger than they say, and more dangerous. She picked up the arrow, carefully holding it by the fletching. The blood on the tip was still fresh. Caleb, finished with his whiskey, slowly turned towards the exit. He said nothing, looked at no one. His gaze was fixed forward, through the open saloon door, onto the dusty street of Phantom River. For a second, he paused, as if pondering something, then walked out, dissolving into the haze of the midday heat. He mounted his horse and rode away, without looking back. Doris and Mabel remained standing in the middle of the saloon. The scene they had just witnessed was so swift and brutal that it seemed unreal. The ranchers slowly began to recover, their voices audible again, but now with anxious undertones. Rumors about Caleb O'Connor were one thing, but now that they had seen him with their own eyes, he seemed even more mysterious and unpredictable. Doris went to the window through which he had just ridden away. Mabel followed her, her gaze fixed on the same spot. He's not like other cowboys, is he? Mabel asked quietly, her voice full of new, incomprehensible emotions. Doris nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "No, Mabel. He's completely different." Her thoughts were occupied not only with Caleb's strength, but also with his strange detachment, his silence, and that persistent, almost ridiculous rumor of his innocence. This thought, however wild it seemed, now took on a new, intriguing meaning. There was something about this man that transcended the usual notions of the Wild West, something that shattered the familiar order and their own illusions. And this something now stirred their minds. They knew their lives had just changed, but they couldn't anticipate how profoundly. After Caleb O'Connor's departure, Phantom River was enveloped in a strange, almost unreal calm, as if holding its breath before a storm. The ranchers, having finished their whiskey, drifted out, casting anxious glances at Doris and Mabel, tinged with a new, hidden respect. Butch McKinley's words of vengeance against Caleb hung heavy in the air, foreboding doom. The sisters, left in the emptying saloon, went about their usual tasks, but their movements were mechanical, and their thoughts drifted far away. Mabel, sweeping the floor, occasionally glanced at the spot where Caleb had stood. Her heart still pounded from what she had seen, and a strange mix of fear and admiration pulsed in her temples. She was 28, and her life experience, hardened by the harsh realities of the Wild West, had not prepared her for this. Mabel had always been pragmatic, with a sharp mind capable of analyzing any situation, but this cowboy defied all her notions of people. His cold composure, incredible marksmanship, and enigmatic aura made her doubt her own judgment. Doris, counting the day's earnings, seemed calmer, but her inner world was as turbulent as her sister's. She was 32, and she had a wealth of stories behind her, joyful and bitter, acquired in this merciless world. She had seen many men, strong and weak, noble and base, but none possessed such detached power. Accustomed to reading people like an open book, Doris faced an impenetrable wall. The rumor of his innocence, which once seemed absurd, now took on a different meaning. This man, capable of piercing a palm with an arrow with such precision, seemed far removed from any human weaknesses, including the desires of the flesh. Perhaps it was this purity that made him so dangerous, so unpredictable. In the evening, when the last patrons had left the saloon, and Phantom River had fallen silent under a blanket of twinkling stars, the sisters sat at a table lit by a single kerosene lamp. Doris cleaned her old but reliable Colt, checking every mechanism. Mabel, thoughtfully stirring her tea, finally broke the silence. "Do you believe what they say, Doris?" Her voice was barely audible. Doris looked up, her gaze serious. "What exactly, Mabel?" "About his marksmanship, about his cruelty." "No, about the other thing." Mabel hesitated, not daring to voice what had long been on their minds. Doris sighed, putting the revolver aside. "I saw his eyes, Mabel. There's no lust in them, no desire, only emptiness, or something I can't understand. But that's impossible. He's a man. Strong, handsome, exactly, but he's different. Perhaps that's why he survived in this world. He doesn't waste energy on what others consider important." "So you think it's true?" Mabel set her mug down, her eyes wide. In her voice was a mix of surprise and some strange, new intrigue. The conversation stretched deep into the night. The sisters pondered this revelation, every aspect of Caleb's behavior, every word spoken about him. The more they reasoned, the more their curiosity grew. Caleb O'Connor's secret was like an undiscovered treasure map, alluring in its unexplored nature. The next morning, the town awoke to the ringing of the bell. It was an ominous sign. Rancher Bill, a short, pot-bellied man with thick red mustaches, burst into the saloon, his face contorted with fear. "Doris, Mabel, the McKinley brothers, they burned down," he shouted, gasping. The sisters instantly became alert. "Burned down how? What happened, Bill?" Doris asked, her voice firm. "Their ranch. Charred ruins were found, and 3 bodies, all with arrows in their backs." Bill's voice trembled. The saloon filled with whispers. Everyone immediately knew who had done it. Caleb O'Connor had kept his promise, and it was even more shocking than what he had done in the saloon. His promise had been fulfilled with such ruthless speed and efficiency that blood ran cold. He hadn't just scared them, he had annihilated them. News of the McKinley brothers spread through the area like a wildfire. The residents of Phantom River, accustomed to violence, were nevertheless shocked by such brutality. The sisters, standing behind the bar, listened to snippets of conversations, observing people's reactions. Doris saw in their eyes a mixture of fear and secret relief. The McKinleys had been a thorn in everyone's side, but she also saw deep anxiety. If Caleb O'Connor could so easily dispatch 3 bandits, what could he do to those who stood in his way? And this question made her heart clench. Mabel, leaning towards her sister, whispered, He truly knows no mercy." Doris merely nodded, her gaze fixed on the street, as if she expected to see his silhouette appear out of nowhere. Days turned into weeks. Caleb did not reappear in Phantom River. The town slowly returned to its routine, but the shadow cast by the cowboy lingered. Rumors of his peculiarity subsided, replaced by stories of his bloody rampage. But for Doris and Mabel, this mystery did not disappear, it only deepened. The more they thought about him, the more they were overcome by an irresistible desire to understand him, to discover what kind of man was hidden behind that mask of cold composure and silence. One day, as the dusty sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in blood-orange hues, an old rancher named Old Man John entered the saloon. His face was weathered with wrinkles, and his eyes, faded by time, had seen much. He ordered a whiskey and, after drinking half the glass, turned to the sisters. "Heard anything, girls? Rumor has it Caleb O'Connor is headed to Blood Creek Town. A gang has been terrorizing merchants there, and the sheriff called him for help. Only he can deal with them." This news stirred Doris and Mabel. An unexpected opportunity. Blood Creek was 2 days' ride from Phantom River, which gave them time. A daring plan began to form in their minds. A plan that could either destroy them or open up a whole new world. "Mabel, I know what you're thinking," Doris said, her eyes burning with resolve. "And I'm thinking the same thing." Mabel nodded. "We have to go. We have to find out what kind of man Caleb O'Connor is, and understand what he's hiding." Their motivation was complex. It wasn't just curiosity, but a desire to challenge established norms, to understand a phenomenon that had so abruptly burst into their lives. Perhaps there was something of a yearning for forbidden knowledge, a desire to touch a mystery that seemed inaccessible, and perhaps there was a touch of adventurousness, a craving for thrills that might disrupt the monotonous rhythm of their lives. They wanted to understand why he was like this, not just believe rumors. The next morning, even before sunrise, Doris and Mabel left Phantom River. They saddled their best horses, taking only the essentials. Doris wore sturdy leather trousers, tough boots, and a loose flannel shirt, her auburn hair tightly braided, her loaded Colt hung at her waist. Mabel chose darker clothing for the journey, coarse canvas trousers and a dark green shirt, her black hair also tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't have her own weapon, but she knew how to handle her father's carbine, which lay in her saddlebag. Their path led them across scorching prairies, through dusty gorges and rocky hills, where every rustle could mean danger. The sun beat down mercilessly, the air thick with dust and the smell of sagebrush. They were not inexperienced riders, but this journey was different. This time, they weren't chasing gold or vengeance, but a mystery. By the end of the second day, they approached Blood Creek, a small, dilapidated town that fully lived up to its name. An atmosphere of danger and hopelessness prevailed here. At the entrance to the town, they were stopped by a sheriff's patrol, 2 sturdy but tired men with dirty bandanas covering their faces. "Where are you headed, ladies?" one of them asked, his eyes wary. We're heading to the saloon." "Two friends," Doris replied, trying to sound calm and confident. Her experience dealing with various people served her well even now. "Well, be careful. The town's not quiet. These fellows who've shown up here know no mercy, and only one man can handle them. Caleb O'Connor. He should be here," the second patrolman said, looking them up and down but not daring to ask too many questions. Further on, they saw scattered bodies in the street, and in places, the charred remains of burned wagons still smoldered. The bank building had been broken into, and gallows stood on the main street, from which bodies swayed. It was a terrifying sight that made them shudder. Horror gripped them, but curiosity and determination were stronger. They dismounted at the only surviving saloon, which looked like a fortress bristling with wooden logs. Inside, it was even gloomier. Several men, their faces filled with fear, sat at tables, clutching weapons. Behind the bar stood a tall, thin sheriff with gray mustaches and deep wrinkles on his face. And next to him, leaning against the counter, was Caleb O'Connor. He was as still and unperturbed as he had been in Phantom River, but his presence here, in the heart of this chaos, was even more terrifying. Doris and Mabel slowly walked to the bar, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Caleb didn't even turn. The sheriff looked at them with undisguised surprise. "What are you doing here, ladies? This is no place for the likes of you." His voice was tired. We're looking for a place to sleep, and perhaps a small sip of whiskey to calm our nerves." Doris smiled, trying to appear as innocent as possible. The sheriff shook his head but gestured to an empty table in the corner. They ordered 2 whiskeys and, sitting at the table, began to observe. Caleb O'Connor was the center of attention, even when silent. His gaze was fixed on the door, as if he expected an attack at any second. The rumors of his taciturn nature proved true. He uttered no words, only occasionally glancing at the sheriff when the latter spoke. But now, amidst this desolation and fear, his silence seemed even more ominous. Mabel leaned towards Doris. "He's like a demon, not a man." Doris nodded. "Perhaps. But that doesn't stop us from solving his mystery." But their confidence was already beginning to crack. This man, Caleb O'Connor, was far more terrifying than they could have imagined. He didn't just kill, he did so with a coldness alien to any living creature. And that peculiarity they had heard about now seemed not just an innocent rumor, but part of his dark, almost inhuman nature. Fear began to creep up on them, seeping under their skin. They had come here to unravel his mystery, but now they realized they had become part of his world. And this world was full of dangers they hadn't suspected. Admiration gave way to undisguised fear, and their initial illusion that they could easily understand this man began to crumble before their eyes. They found themselves deeper than they planned, caught in a whirlpool they might not survive. The sisters, Doris and Mabel, sat at a corner table in the Blood Creek Saloon, watching Caleb O'Connor. The atmosphere in the establishment was electrifying, every nerve stretched to its limit, anticipating the inevitable. The scent of dust, sweat, and fear mingled with the acrid aroma of cheap whiskey. Moonlight, piercing through gaps in the shutters, cast ominous shadows, making the faces of those present appear like masks. Doris, whose auburn hair, now dusted with road grime, seemed even darker, clutched her whiskey glass tightly, her gaze fixed on Caleb. Mabel, with her piercing dark eyes, intently studied his movements, trying to find some clue, some hint of the man behind the mask of cold composure. Caleb stood at the bar counter, absolutely motionless, like a statue, his white-brimmed hat obscuring his eyes, but his entire body radiated tension. He was the embodiment of indomitable force, unpredictable as lightning in a stormy sky. The scar on his right cheekbone appeared darker in the dim light, giving him an even more severe look. The sheriff, sitting next to him, nervously stroked his gray mustache, occasionally glancing at the cowboy, as if awaiting his instructions. Suddenly, a shot rang out, piercing the silence. One of the lamps hanging from the ceiling exploded, showering the floor with shards and plunging part of the saloon into darkness. It was a signal. From the street came shouts, the thud of hooves, and more gunshots. The gang had attacked. The men in the saloon instantly grabbed their weapons, their faces contorted with fear. Doris, without losing a second, drew her Colt and took a position behind an overturned table, covering Mabel. Mabel, in turn, quickly pulled her carbine from her saddlebag. Her hands, though trembling, were surprisingly steady. The sheriff, crouching, yelled, "Caleb, they're everywhere!" But the cowboy was already acting. He didn't draw his revolver. His hand, flashing, pulled something from his belt that turned out to be a throwing knife. In the same second, the knife plunged into the chest of a bandit who had just burst into the saloon. His eyes filled with madness. The bandit fell to the floor, without making a sound. It was so fast and silent that it seemed unreal. A shootout began. Bullets tore through walls, shattered bottles, and the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and death. Caleb moved like a shadow, appearing here and there, his arrows and knives finding targets with terrifying accuracy. He was not just a shooter, he was a killing machine, devoid of emotion, operating with perfect efficiency. He said not a word, only his movements spoke for themselves. Every throw was lethal, every target hit without fail. Doris and Mabel also participated in the fight. Doris, with her shooting experience, accurately struck targets, her Colt spitting fire, and bullets finding their victims. Mabel, though less experienced, tried to keep up, her carbine thundering, and she felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with fear. They were scared, but their determination to survive and unravel Caleb's mystery gave them strength. They saw one of the bandits, a huge, bearded man with an axe, rush at Caleb. The cowboy didn't flinch. He simply dodged the blow, and his hand again darted to his belt. This time, He drew something that looked like a small but very sharp blade, hidden under his leather vest. With one movement, he slashed the bandit's throat. Blood gushed out like a fountain, and the bandit, clutching his throat, collapsed to the floor. It was an incredibly brutal, yet effective, execution. Horror was written on Doris and Mabel's faces. This wasn't just a cowboy, this was a ruthless executioner. The bandits, seeing their comrades fall one by one, began to retreat. Caleb, without stopping, pursued them, his movements swift and precise. He showed neither anger nor joy, only cold, calculating efficiency. The shootout ceased as abruptly as it began. Silence descended on the saloon, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the death rattles. Doris and Mabel slowly rose from the table, their hearts still pounding. They were unharmed, but the shock of what they had experienced was immense. The sheriff, limping, approached Caleb, who was already surveying the battlefield. We've never seen such carnage," the sheriff croaked, his face pale. You're incredible." Caleb, without turning, simply nodded. He was gathering his arrows and knives, wiping them clean of blood. His hands were stained, but he showed no revulsion. It was part of his work. Doris and Mabel approached him. Doris, overcoming her trembling, asked, "Caleb, who are you?" The cowboy slowly turned. His eyes, which they had only seen a few times, were full of unresolved mystery. There was no malice or triumph in them, only a deep, almost cosmic emptiness. "I know one." His voice was still low, but now there was a hint of weariness in it. "Just a man who does what he must." These words only confused them further. He was not just a man, but not a demon either. He was something entirely different. Night fell on Blood Creek, bringing with it a cold wind and the smell of death. Doris and Mabel couldn't sleep. They sat by the fire the sheriff had built, trying to ward off the cold and fear. Caleb sat apart, silent as ever, his silhouette outlined against the glowing embers. He was detached, reclusive, yet his presence was palpable. Suddenly, Mabel stood up. "I can't do this anymore. I have to understand. Tomorrow I'll talk to him." Doris looked at her, her eyes full of worry. "Are you sure, Mabel? He's dangerous, I know, but I can't leave without solving this mystery. It's more important than anything." Her voice was filled with a determination that surprised even Doris herself. Mabel, despite her pragmatism, had always been more emotional than her older sister, and now that emotion was pushing her to a dangerous step, she felt she had to understand this man, even if it cost her life. Her motives were deeper than mere curiosity. It was a desire to understand the nature of evil, or at least what appeared to be evil, and to find out if there was anything else beyond that emptiness. In the morning, Doris and Mabel found themselves again in the saloon, which now looked even more dilapidated. The sheriff, having gathered the few surviving townsfolk, was discussing how to restore order. Caleb, as always, stood apart, inspecting his arrows. Mabel approached him. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Caleb," her voice came out louder than she expected. "I need to talk to you." The cowboy slowly raised his head. His eyes, as impassive as ever, stared directly at her. He waited. We've heard a lot about you," Mabel began. Her voice trembled, but she continued. "About your peculiarity. About you being a virgin. Is that true? I wouldn't hesitate to make love with such a guy." Caleb didn't answer immediately. His gaze sharpened for a moment, as if her words had struck a chord. Then he slowly, almost reluctantly, nodded. "That's none of your business. Perhaps, but we're here because we want to understand. We want to teach you." At that moment, something in Caleb's eyes changed. Not surprise, not anger, but something deeper, almost imperceptible. He looked at Doris, who stood slightly apart, and then back at Mabel. A shadow of doubt flickered in his gaze, then it became absolutely impassive again. "Teach me what?" His voice was dry, but now there was a barely noticeable intonation that they hadn't heard before, something like a challenge, or perhaps even derision. "Teach you life," Mabel replied, her voice now more confident. "Teach you what's hidden beyond your cruelty." This moment was the culmination of their growing intrigue and fear. The illusion of an invincible, impervious Caleb began to crumble, revealing something new and frightening to them. They challenged him, but were they ready for what would follow? In this man, who seemed carved from stone, lay huge, unexplored power, and they were about to unleash it. That the price for that could be exorbitant. Fear of the unknown mingled with a growing sense of admiration for his unwavering strength and the feeling that they had embarked on a dangerous path became stronger. The morning in Blood Creek arrived with a cold, gray light that brought neither comfort nor hope. The saloon, having survived the night's battle, looked even more battered than before. Debris of furniture, broken glass, and the smell of blood and gunpowder still hung in the air everywhere. The challenge Mabel had thrown at Caleb hung in the air like an invisible bell, its echoes reverberating in the sisters' hearts. Doris, with her thick auburn hair plastered to her sweaty forehead, couldn't take her eyes off the cowboy. Her mind frantically sorted through all possible scenarios, but none promised an easy ride. Mabel, whose dark eyes now seemed even deeper from lack of sleep, stood opposite Caleb, her hands clenched and her shoulders tense. She felt the adrenaline pulsing through her veins, but now it was mixed with a new, heavy fear of the unknown and of this man. Caleb O'Connor, standing at the bar, did not stir. He looked at Mabel with the same impassive emptiness in his eyes, but this time, Doris swore. In the depths of his pupils, something like a spark of interest flickered, barely discernible, like a shadow in the dawn's haze. His lips, usually tightly pressed, twitched for a moment, barely noticeably, as if he was trying to suppress a smirk, or perhaps he experienced something akin to astonishment. This was the very moment when their illusion of him, as a completely unperturbed being, began to crumble, revealing new, frightening facets. "Teach me." Life. His voice was dry, almost indifferent, but now there was a barely perceptible note in it that the sisters had not heard before, something like a challenge, or perhaps even mockery. "And what, young ladies, do you intend to teach me? How to grow flowers in the desert? Or how to sing lullabies to wolves?" Mabel stepped forward, her resolve seemingly growing with each passing second. "We will teach you everything you've missed. Emotions, feelings, what it means to be a human, not a killing machine." Caleb slowly turned his head to Doris. There were no questions in his gaze, but there was an expectation. Doris, overcoming an internal tremor, nodded. "We're both in this. We want to help you." She didn't want to lie, but she felt it was necessary for Caleb to accept them. The cowboy pushed off the counter and took a step towards them. Each of his steps was measured, silent, like a predator's. He stopped a few feet away from them, his shadow covering the sisters, as if portending something ominous. "Help me." His voice was now slightly louder, and a dangerous intonation appeared in it, as if he was weighing every word. "Do you really think you can change what has long become a part of me? What allowed me to survive where others fell dead?" He gestured around the ruined saloon, then pointed to the street where the unburied bodies of the bandits lay. This is my life, and it tolerates no sentimentality." Mabel didn't flinch. "We believe there's something more in every person, even in you." Caleb looked at her again, and this time his gaze was heavy, piercing, as if he was trying to look into her soul. "Well, so be it. But if you're going to teach me, then first you must understand what my life is like. You must walk my path." He took a small, worn leather pouch from his pocket and threw it onto the counter. The pouch clinked, something heavy rolled inside. "This is gold. For your service. If you agree, meet me at dawn outside the town. Alone. If you don't come, I'll understand." He didn't wait for an answer. Turning, he left the saloon, disappearing into the twilight. The people remaining in the saloon looked at the sisters with undisguised astonishment and apprehension. The sheriff, approaching them, shook his head. "Girls, are you out of your minds? You don't know what you're getting into. This man, he's not like us. He's a walking ghost, and going with him into the desert, that's certain death. We know." "Sheriff," Doris replied, her voice firm, though her heart pounded. "We can't back down now." Mabel picked up the pouch of gold. It was heavy, its cold metal burning her skin. She felt that it wasn't just payment, but payment for entry into a completely different, alien world from which they might not return. For a moment, despair gripped her. What were they doing? Why had they gotten involved in this? But then she remembered his eyes, a barely perceptible spark of interest, and the feeling that behind that impassive mask lay something important, something that had to be revealed. Took over again. The night was long and restless. The sisters gathered their last supplies, checked their weapons. Doris, ever the pragmatist, drew up a map of their route, trying to anticipate where Caleb might lead them. Mabel, sitting by the fire, sifted through cartridges, her thoughts racing. She was appalled by his brutality, yet at the same time, an irresistible attraction to this mystery. A desire to understand what had made him this way consumed her. It was no longer mere curiosity. but something deeper, almost an obsession. At dawn, as the sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in blood-red hues, Doris and Mabel saddled their horses and headed for the designated meeting place. Outside the town, against the backdrop of the sprawling prairies, Caleb awaited them. He stood by his black stallion, motionless as ever, his silhouette seemingly carved from the dawn sky. There was no smile, no greeting from him. He simply looked at them, and in his gaze was something akin to approval, but without a hint of emotion. "You came." His voice was a statement of fact. "Well, the journey will be long and dangerous. Are you ready to face my life?" Doris and Mabel nodded. Their hearts beat in unison. They were ready, but they didn't know for what exactly. They rode west, deep into the vast desert, under the scorching sun. Caleb rode ahead, never looking back, as if he were a guiding spirit leading them into the unknown. He didn't speak, only gestured when they needed to turn, when to stop. They crossed sun-baked canyons, traversed dusty plains where only cacti and sparse thorny bushes could survive. Along the way, they encountered dried riverbeds where water once flowed, but now there were only cracks in the earth and stones smoothed by time. Gradually, the sisters began to get used to his silence, to his inexhaustible energy. They saw how he hunted silently, precisely, without missing. He could shoot a rabbit with his revolver from an incredible distance, or throw an arrow at a deer so that it fell without making a sound. He taught them to survive, how to find water in the most unexpected places, how to read animal tracks, how to navigate by the stars. But he taught them not with words, but by example. His actions spoke louder than any instruction. His existence was devoid of everything superfluous, every emotion, every feeling that could hinder survival. This was a world where there was no place for weakness, for attachment, for love. One day, as they stopped for a rest at the foot of red cliffs, Mabel ventured to speak. "Caleb, why are you like this? What made you this way?" He sat, sharpening one of his throwing knives, his eyes fixed on the distance. He didn't answer immediately. Doris tensed, expecting him to remain silent or dismiss her. But this time, he spoke. "This world," his voice was low and hoarse, as if he were talking to himself, "it takes everything you have, and then it wants more. If you give it that, you die. I just don't give." His words were like a blow. They didn't explain his callousness, but they revealed the reason for his detachment. The world of the Wild West was ruthless, and Caleb was its product, its reflection. Soon they came upon a small encampment. An old wagon, a few scrawny horses, a smoldering campfire. It seemed to be a family of settlers, but something was wrong. Bodies lay around the wagon, and the air was thick with the smell of fresh blood. Caleb immediately dismounted, his movements becoming tense. Doris and Mabel followed him, their hearts sinking. They saw 3 bandits finishing off the wounded, their faces contorted with greed and cruelty. "Bandits," Caleb growled, his voice cold as ice. "Stay here." But the sisters couldn't stay on the sidelines. They saw the horror of what was happening, and anger surged through them. "No," Mabel cried out, "we'll fight too." Caleb glanced at them, and something that could be interpreted as disapproval flickered in his eyes, but he said nothing. He disappeared into the bushes, his movement silent. Soon, a short, muffled cry rang out, and then another. Doris and Mabel, grabbing their weapons, cautiously moved forward. They saw Caleb. He stood over the bodies of 2 bandits, his knife bloody. The 3rd bandit, younger than the others, tried to flee, but Caleb caught him with incredible speed. He didn't shoot or throw an arrow. He simply grabbed the bandit by the throat and, with one powerful movement, snapped his neck. The sound of cracking bones was deafening in the ensuing silence. Doris and Mabel froze. They had seen brutality, but such a cold-blooded, emotionless execution, devoid of even a hint of anger, shook them to their core. Caleb turned to them. His face was as impassive as ever. He showed no trace of emotion, no hint of regret. It wasn't just killing, it was annihilation, executed with mechanical precision. "This is what my life looks like." His voice was quiet, but in it now resounded an undisguised, terrifying truth, ruthless and swift. The sisters, exchanging glances, felt their initial illusion that they could teach this man shatter. Shock engulfed them, piercing them to the bone. They thought they were ready for this, but they weren't. Caleb O'Connor was not just a broken man. He was a predator who had embraced his nature, and in his world, there was no place for the values they tried to instill in him. They found themselves trapped in a world where good and evil merged into one faceless blur, and their own fear was now mixed with horror at what they had seen. The world they had entered was far darker than they could have imagined, and they began to realize that their mission might prove not only futile, but also deadly. The silence hanging over the scene of the massacre was heavier than the air itself. The sound of cracking bones, echoing in the parched desert, still lingered in Doris and Mabel's ears. Doris, with her usual steely composure, felt her knees buckle, and she had to lean on the barrel of her Colt to keep from falling. Her auburn hair was disheveled, and her eyes, usually full of determination, were now wide with horror. Mabel, the more emotional of the two, stood as if petrified, her face pale, and her coal-black eyes, reflecting the last rays of sunlight, seemed like bottomless wells of fear. She felt her stomach twist with nausea, and her heart pounded so violently it seemed about to burst from her chest. This was not just shock, it was a profound, physical jolt that pierced them to their very core, shattering all remaining vestiges of their naive notions. Caleb O'Connor, standing over the bandit's body, did not even glance at them. He slowly wiped his bloody knife on the dead man's trousers, his movements as mechanical and emotionless as ever. Not a muscle twitched on his grim face, the scar on his cheekbone seemed even more pronounced. For him, it was just another task, executed with cold efficiency. No regret, no triumph, not even a hint of revulsion, only emptiness, ruthless and frightening. His existence was devoid of the ethical frameworks to which they were accustomed. "They are dead." His voice was quiet, but there was no empathy or threat in it. "Those who survived must move on." He pointed to the settler's wagon, from which quiet sobs could be heard. 2 women and 3 children, frightened to death, sat huddled together under an old tarp. Caleb, without waiting for their reaction, approached them, his step silent. He offered no words of comfort, only silently examined them, assessed their condition, and then, taking a piece of dried meat from his bag, offered it to one of the women. His gesture was purely practical, devoid of any warmth, but for the frightened people, it was salvation. Doris and Mabel watched him, trying to comprehend what they had seen. This man was a paradox. He was capable of such ruthlessness, yet at the same time, he helped those in need, albeit without any emotional involvement. Their initial admiration for his strength was now mixed with deep unease, and their mission to teach him seemed not just difficult, but almost impossible. They had come to uncover his humanity, but he seemed to be the embodiment of everything wild and merciless in this world. The sisters joined him, helping the settlers. Doris, regaining her composure, began to bandage wounds, her hands moving confidently and quickly. Mabel, though still shaken, began to search for water and supplies. When they finished, Caleb, without a word, mounted his stallion again. "We must leave. It's not safe here." His words were direct and undeniable. They moved west again, but now their path was different. The sisters rode in tense silence, their thoughts consumed only by Caleb. He rode ahead, his silhouette seeming to be a part of the wild landscape, his back straight and unyielding. Doris felt a sadness begin to creep into her. A sadness not only for herself and Mabel, but also for him. For a man who seemed destined to eternal loneliness, deprived of all human joys. Mabel, riding alongside Doris, finally broke the silence. Did we make a mistake, Doris?" Her voice was hoarse. He's impervious to change." Doris shook her head, her gaze fixed on Caleb's back. "I don't know, Mabel. Perhaps his life is what we must understand before we try to change anything." Her words were full of bitter irony. A few days later, they reached a rocky desert where the sun beat down even harder, and water was worth its weight in gold. Their supplies were running low. The horses were tired, and even Caleb seemed to be feeling the strain of the long journey. He remained silent, but the sisters noticed that he had become even more tense, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, searching for signs of danger or, perhaps, hope. One evening, as they stopped to rest at the foot of a huge, solitary rock, Caleb, to their surprise, broke his silence. He sat, tossing dry branches into the campfire, his silhouette outlined against a vast, starry sky. "Tomorrow will be a difficult day. There's almost no water. We must find it or..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. This was the first time he had acknowledged their presence in such a way, the first time he had shown his dependence on external circumstances, albeit indirectly. It was a small but significant change in his behavior that made the sisters see him in a new light. He was not just a machine, he was a being who also fought for survival. The next morning, under the scorching sun, their journey became unbearable. The heat was blistering, and their throats were parched. The horses moved slowly, treading heavily over the hot stones. Doris and Mabel felt their strength draining away, but they continued to move, following Caleb. He, as always, led the way, his figure a symbol of indomitable will. His mustache, his hat, his clothes, even his sun-scorched eyes were perfectly clean. He seemed oblivious to the dust or the heat. At noon, they came across a dried-up riverbed. The ground was cracked, and the stones were scorching hot. Hope faded, but Caleb didn't give up. He dismounted and, dropping the reins of his stallion, began to examine the area. His movements were swift and precise. He was searching for something. Doris and Mabel, with their last ounce of strength, followed him. They watched as he crouched down by one of the rocks, his fingers feeling the surface of the earth. Then he took a small, pointed stone from his bag and began to dig. The sisters, barely understanding what he was doing, also began to dig next to him, using their knives and hands. After a while, when their strength was almost exhausted, Caleb let out a short, muffled sound. From beneath the ground, from under a layer of sand and stones, a thin trickle of water seeped out. It was life-saving moisture, slowly pushing its way to the surface. The sisters, rushing to it, drank greedily. The water was muddy, warm, but it was life. At that moment, they understood that Caleb didn't just kill, he also saved. He was the embodiment of the desert itself, harsh, merciless, but at the same time capable of giving life to those who knew how to seek it. After they had quenched their thirst, Caleb, without a word, mounted his horse again. He expected no gratitude, sought no praise. For him, it was simply survival. Doris and Mabel, feeling a little better, also saddled their horses. But now their view of Caleb was different. They were still afraid of him, but now that fear was mixed with a deep, almost painful understanding. He was not only a killing machine, but also a master of survival, a man who knew this world better than anyone else. Their illusions of his simple innocence or cruelty finally collapsed. He was far more complex than they could have imagined, and their mission began to take a completely different turn. They moved on, deeper into the desert, under the vast, indifferent sky. The sun slowly set, painting the horizon in fiery tones. The sisters rode in silence, but now this silence was filled not only with fear but also with deep sorrow. Sorrow that they hadn't understood him right away. Sorrow that they had to go through such horror to see the truth. But in this sorrow, there was also a measure of acceptance that the world is not always as it seems, and that people can be far more complex than their outward appearance. And in this acceptance lay their own transformation, their path to understanding not only Caleb but also themselves. Caleb's world was a world of absolute survival, where emotions were merely a hindrance, and they, having gone through the horror of his methods, began to realize this. The sun, it seemed, was determined to burn everything alive in this rocky desert. Each day was a test of endurance, and the sisters, Doris and Mabel, felt it keenly. Their skin was parched by the winds, their hair bleached by the sun, and their once bright clothes were covered in a layer of dust. Doris, with her usual composed demeanor, now looked tired. Her eyes constantly squinted against the bright light, but in them burned an unquenchable resolve. Mabel, whose youthful freshness had faded, moved with a barely perceptible grace, acquired over these days. Her face had become harder, but deep inside she was still the same curious and emotional girl. They rode in tense silence, broken only by the creak of saddles and the heavy breathing of the horses. Caleb O'Connor, who always rode ahead, seemed impervious to this element. His skin, already tanned, had taken on the hue of cured leather, and his eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, continued to scan the horizon, as if he could see what was hidden from ordinary eyes. He was still taciturn, but the sisters had already learned to read him by the smallest movements, by the barely noticeable changes in his posture. He was the embodiment of the desert itself, harsh, merciless, but offering a chance of survival to those who knew its laws. They understood that they could not teach him what they considered life until they themselves had gone through his school of survival. One evening, as they stopped to rest at a winding canyon, Caleb, to their surprise, spoke not about the road ahead or the search for water, but about something entirely different. He sat, tossing dry branches into the campfire, his silhouette outlined against a vast, starry sky. I once saw my family. His voice was quiet, almost unrecognizable, as if these words were torn from him with great difficulty. Father, mother, younger sister. Doris and Mabel froze. This was the first time he had spoken of his past, of anything personal. They sat motionless, afraid to disturb this fragile moment of revelation. They were killed, Caleb continued, his gaze fixed on the fire, and in his eyes, for a moment, flickered such pain, such sorrow, that the sisters shuddered. "And it's for nothing, just because." Then he fell silent again. The silence that followed his words was deafening. It was filled with unspoken grief, with pain that had lived in this man for years. Doris and Mabel, exchanging glances, felt their hearts clench with compassion. In that moment, he was not just a killing machine, he was a wounded man who had endured unbearable loss. Their own problems, their own fears seemed insignificant compared to his pain. They felt their initial fear of him begin to mix with deep compassion. I'm sorry," Mabel whispered, her voice full of sincere sympathy. Caleb merely shook his head. "Pity, it's weakness. It won't bring them back." His words were harsh, but there was a grain of truth in them. In this world, pity was indeed a luxury few could afford. But the sisters understood that behind this harshness lay a deep, unhealed wound. The next morning, their path led through narrow, dusty ravines, where every stone could conceal danger. The scent of a wild animal hung in the air, and Caleb, instantly alerted, raised a hand, stopping them. He dismounted and, ordering them to stay put, disappeared among the rocks. Soon, sounds of struggle reached them, muffled thuds, growls, and then a piercing scream. Doris and Mabel, unable to bear it, rushed to help, grabbing their weapons. They saw Caleb. He was fighting a huge, enraged grizzly bear. The beast was enormous, its claws sharp as knives, and its maw foamed. Caleb, armed only with his knife, moved with incredible agility, dodging the beast's blows, but the bear was too strong. A deep wound was already visible on his hand, protecting his face, from which blood oozed. It was a fight for life or death. "Caleb!" Doris cried out, raising her Colt. She aimed, but was afraid to miss and wound him. Mabel, with her carbine, also hesitated. Caleb, hearing them, turned, his face distorted with pain, but his eyes still burned with unwavering resolve. "Don't come closer. Get back," he roared. He didn't want them to get hurt. At that moment, the sisters saw something more in him than just a ruthless cowboy. They saw a man who, despite his pain, was trying to protect them, but the bear was too fast. It dealt a powerful blow with its paw, throwing Caleb against the rock. The cowboy fell, his knife flying to the side. The bear, rising on its hind legs, roared, preparing to deliver a fatal blow. At that moment, Doris and Mabel acted instinctively. Doris, without hesitation, fired. The bullet struck the bear in the shoulder, making it roar with pain. Mabel, not far behind, fired her carbine, and the bullet plunged into the beast's head. The bear collapsed to the ground, its huge body convulsing in death throes, and then lay still. Doris and Mabel ran to Caleb. He lay against the rock, breathing heavily, his right arm badly injured, blood seeping from a deep wound. His vest was torn, and scratches from claws were visible on his powerful chest. He was wounded, but alive. "Caleb." Doris knelt beside him, her voice trembling. She quickly took a clean cloth from her bag and began to bandage his arm. Mabel, crouching beside her, carefully examined him. Caleb looked at them. There was no emptiness in his eyes now. There was something akin to surprise, or perhaps even relief. He hadn't expected them to come to his aid, that they would risk their lives for him. "Why?" His voice was weak, but in it now was a question the sisters had never heard from him before. You tried to protect us," Doris replied, her hands continuing to bandage the wound steadily. "We couldn't leave you." Mabel nodded. "We're here to teach you life, Caleb. And life isn't just about survival, but also helping each other." They spent the rest of the day resting. Doris and Mabel took care of Caleb, dressing his wounds, feeding him. He, to their surprise, did not resist. His silence continued, but now it was different. There was no detachment in it, but rather acceptance. He allowed them to care for him, which in itself was a huge step. On this day, their mission began to take on new meaning. They were not just trying to teach him, they were learning from him themselves. Learning to survive, learning to understand that behind a mask of cruelty and indifference could hide deep pain and a desire to protect. Their sorrow gave way to a new acceptance of his complex nature, and their fear of him was replaced by deep, almost tender compassion. They understood that the path would be long, but now they had hope. Hope that, by going through his world, they could find in him what he himself had long lost. Time flowed slowly, steadily, like sand in desert hourglasses, marking each day of their shared journey. Several weeks had passed since Doris and Mabel saved Caleb from the deadly embrace of the grizzly. His wounds, deep and painful, were gradually healing under the careful supervision of the sisters. They stopped in secluded places where water was relatively accessible and allowed him to rest. During these days, Caleb, who had always seemed carved from stone, appeared to them in a different light. His muscular body, usually hidden by clothes, was scarred, evidence of countless battles and survival in a ruthless world. Old bullet and knife marks were visible on his powerful chest, and deep claw marks on his arms. He lay by the fire, his eyes, usually impassive, sometimes lingered for a moment on the sisters, as if he was trying to understand something. Doris, with her thick auburn hair tied in a tight braid, and eyes the color of liquid honey, which now expressed deep thoughtfulness, dressed his wounds daily. She felt the warmth of his skin under her fingers, felt the firmness of his muscles, and in those moments, her heart ached with a strange, new emotion. This was more than just compassion. It was acceptance of him as he was, with all his scars, both physical and emotional. Mabel, with her coal black eyes that had become even more penetrating, watched them. She cooked simple food, took care of the camp, and every day she saw how Doris patiently cared for Caleb, and he, to their surprise, did not resist, allowing them to look after him. This was an unprecedented display of trust for him. Sometimes Caleb broke his silence, but his words were rare, fragmented, as if he had forgotten how to speak. He spoke of the desert, of how to read tracks in the sand, how to predict weather by the stars, how to find food where there seemed to be none. He taught them how to survive, and he did so without condescension, but also without his former ruthlessness. The sisters listened intently, absorbing his every word, every gesture. They understood that they were undergoing a unique schooling in life, and that this man, Caleb O'Connor, was their teacher. Their initial mission to teach him now seemed distant and naive. They were now learning from him, and in this was a deep, almost mystical inspiration. One night, as the moon bathed the desert in silver light, Caleb, sitting by the campfire, for the first time ever, looked at Doris and Mabel not with impassivity, but with something akin to interest. "Why did you stay?" His voice was quiet, but now a sincere note of bewilderment sounded in it. "You could have left me to die." Doris glanced at Mabel, then back at Caleb. "We don't abandon our own," she replied, her voice firm. "And you're not a stranger." Caleb looked at them for a long time, and then, to their complete astonishment, his lips twitched, and a barely noticeable, short smile appeared on his face. It was the first smile they had seen on his face, and it was like a ray of light in a dark cave. This smile, fragile and almost invisible, shattered the last remnants of his impassivity. He was capable of feeling. He was capable of smiling. And this discovery became a shock for the sisters, a shock from realizing his deep humanity, hidden beneath years of pain and survival. Their journey continued. Caleb, though slowly, began to change. He was still taciturn, but now there was no former detachment in his silence. Sometimes he shared food with them, sometimes pointed out beautiful landscapes, though he himself did not voice words of admiration. His movements became less abrupt, his gaze less cold. The sisters saw him cautiously touch flowers growing in the crevices of rocks, or watch birds circling in the sky. They understood that he had not changed completely, but something new was awakening in him, something that had been suppressed by years of brutal struggle. One day, they came across an old, abandoned ranch, half-ruined, with leaning walls and empty windows. Life once thrived here, but now only memories remained. Caleb, riding up to it, dismounted. His movements were tense. He slowly walked through the yard, his gaze fixed on the old well, on the remains of the cattle pen. Then he stopped at a small, dilapidated cabin. Here was my family." His voice was barely audible. This is my ranch." Doris and Mabel, standing a little distance away, felt their hearts clench. This was the place of his tragedy, the place where he lost everything. Now they understood why he was like this, why he clung so desperately to life, not letting the world take anything more from him. His words were poignant, full of deep, unbearable sorrow. It was not just a place, it was the graveyard of his past, and now they stood on it with him. Inside the cabin, disorder reigned, overturned furniture, broken dishes, signs of struggle. On one of the walls hung a yellowed photograph, a young woman with kind eyes, a man with strong hands, and a little girl with a mischievous smile. This was Caleb's family. He slowly approached the photograph, his fingers gently touching the image of the little girl, Mary. His voice was filled with unbearable pain. "My sister." The sisters saw his pain, his suffering, his loneliness. At that moment, he was not just a cowboy, he was a man who had endured an unimaginable loss. And this loss had made him who he was. Their sorrow for him deepened, turning into profound compassion that pierced them to the core. They understood that his callousness was merely a shield, a protection against pain that could have destroyed him. Suddenly, Caleb turned to them, his eyes, full of pain and despair, settled on Doris. They took everything from me. And I couldn't protect them." His voice wavered, and he lowered his head. For the first time, they saw him like this, broken, vulnerable, crushed by grief. This was a moment of profound shock for the sisters, who realized the full depth of his tragedy. They saw not a dispassionate killer, but a man whose life had been utterly destroyed. And this realization changed everything. Their mission to teach him now transformed into something far greater, a desire to help him heal, to find new meaning in life, to reclaim what had been lost. Caleb O'Connor's words, whispered amidst the ruins of his past, echoed in the hearts of Doris and Mabel. They took everything from me. And I couldn't protect them." In these words lay all his pain, all his tragedy. Doris, with her thick auburn hair plastered to her damp temples, knelt beside him, her eyes filled with tears she had held back for so long. She felt his grief as her own, and in that moment, all her former judgments of him vanished, leaving only boundless compassion. Mabel, whose coal black eyes were now also moist, sat down on the other side, placing a hand on his shoulder. Caleb, for the first time in years, did not pull away. He sat like a shattered monument, his powerful shoulders trembling with unwept sorrow. They spent the rest of the day in this graveyard of his memories. The sisters, despite their own shock, tried to be strong for him. They lit a fire from old planks, prepared a meager supper, and then simply sat beside him, without uttering a word. They understood that words were powerless here, that the only thing they could give him was their presence, their acceptance of his pain. The moon, full and bright, illuminated the ranch ruins, and in that light, Caleb's past seemed even more ominous and real. He seemed, for the first time ever, to fully release his emotions, plunging into the abyss of grief. The next day, as the sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in soft pink hues, Caleb slowly rose. His eyes were swollen and red, but the former emptiness was gone. There was deep sorrow, but mixed with it was something new, something akin to resolve, to an awareness that the past, however painful, should not define his entire future. He slowly walked to the old, leaning fence where the horses had once stood. His fingers grazed the weathered wood, and then he turned to the sisters. "What now?" His voice was hoarse, but it lacked its former despair. "What were you going to teach me?" Doris and Mabel exchanged glances. Their mission, it seemed, had changed, but its essence remained the same. "We were going to teach you to live," Doris replied, her voice soft but firm. "Teach you that even after such a loss, you can find new meaning. You can feel again." Mabel nodded. "You can love again and be loved." Caleb looked at them for a long time. In his eyes was reflected an inner struggle, a struggle between old wounds and new hope. He was a predator, hardened in battle, but his heart was wounded, and the sisters, with their own hands, were slowly healing him. In this moment, he was vulnerable, as never before, and it was this vulnerability that made him truly human. He slowly approached Doris. His large, calloused hand gently rose, and his fingers touched her cheek. It was a light, almost weightless touch, but in it was such tenderness, such sorrow, that Doris's heart skipped a beat. She felt the warmth of his hand, his unspoken desire to touch, to feel, to be close. Then he shifted his gaze to Mabel, and his hand gently touched her hair. In his eyes was something that could be called a question, hope, a plea. In that moment, their decision, their true mission, became clear. They had to show him what love was, what intimacy was, what human warmth was. They had to teach him what he had missed, what the world had taken from him. Doris slowly raised her hand and placed it on his palm, which still rested on her cheek. Mabel, in turn, gently nestled against his other arm. "We will teach you," Doris whispered, her voice full of determination and tenderness. "We will be with you," Mabel added, her eyes looking at him with a new, deep hope. They remained at the ranch. Days turned into nights, and under their gentle guidance, Caleb slowly but surely began to return to life. They taught him to laugh, taught him to trust, taught him to love. At first, it was difficult, as if he were learning to breathe again. His body, accustomed to struggle and survival, now learned to enjoy simple things: touches, embraces, words. He, who had never known intimacy, who considered it a weakness, was now discovering its true power. He learned that there was no need to hide feelings, that sharing them was not weakness, but a source of strength. Caleb, whose mustache and hat had always been his unchanging attributes, now often took off his hat, allowing the sun to caress his face. His stern gaze softened, and his silence filled with new meaning. He was no longer a ruthless predator. He was a man who was learning to live again. And in this lay their triumph. A triumph over the cruelty of the world, over losses, over loneliness. They didn't just teach him, they resurrected him. Their relationship became complex, deep, intertwined, transcending ordinary notions of love. They were not merely teachers and pupil, they were companions who together walked the path of healing. Caleb, once solitary and aloof, was now surrounded by care and love he never thought he would experience. He learned what touch was, what a kiss was, what true intimacy was, extending beyond physiology to become a union of souls. He, who considered himself a machine, discovered in himself a vast capacity to love and be loved. And this discovery filled his life with a completely new, profound inspiration. Together, they built a new ranch, raising it from the ashes, and in every new lock, in every nail, lay their shared hope for the future. Years later, Caleb O'Connor became a different man. He was still strong, still taciturn, but now in his silence was wisdom, and in his eyes warmth. He became the protector of his family, his lands, but his methods were now different. He no longer killed mercilessly, but neither did he allow injustice to triumph. He became a symbol of rebirth, a man who went through hell and found his paradise thanks to the love and care of two strong women. Their story, of two girls who taught a cowboy about life and love, became a legend of the Wild West, passed down from mouth to mouth, as an anthem to the strength of the human spirit and the ability to heal. Conclusion and lesson for the modern world: the story of Caleb, Doris, and Mabel in the harsh realities of the Wild West of the 1880s, though seemingly distant, carries a deep, timeless lesson that is particularly relevant for our audience of 65+. It shows that even the deepest wounds inflicted by life, be it loss, betrayal, or loneliness, are not a death sentence. Caleb, who had become an emotionless survival machine, was able to regain his humanity thanks to the compassion, patience, and unconditional love of two women. In the modern world, where people often face loneliness, disappointment, and a desire for detachment, this story reminds us of the value of human connection, empathy, and the capacity for healing. Many of us, like Caleb, build walls around ourselves to protect against pain, thereby missing out on the joy and depth of human relationships. This story urges us not to give up, not to close ourselves off, but to seek ways to understand and accept others, even those who seem completely alien or broken. It teaches that true strength lies not in the absence of feelings, but in the ability to endure pain, heal, and reopen oneself to the world, to find new meaning in it and, most importantly, to find love. For our grandparents, this is a reminder that it's never too late to start anew, that every day offers a chance for rebirth, and that the deepest bonds are built on a foundation of mutual support and human warmth.